Today's webinar is really about a critical topic of conversation right now, which is how do we take alt proteins mainstream? What are those drivers of sales? What are successful alt protein companies doing to reach consumers? And really, what are those practical strategies to reach those mainstream consumers that we all want to be reaching? We will be digging into all of that and more in today's seminar. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items. First of all, for those of you that may be new to the work of the Good Food Institute, we are an international nonprofit focused on developing the roadmap for sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. To do that, we identify the most effective solutions, we mobilize resources and talent, and we empower partners across the food system to make alt proteins accessible, affordable, and most importantly, delicious. Second, we will be recording this webinar and we will be posting a copy of the recording to our YouTube channel. We will also be emailing all of you and everyone who registered a copy of the recording so you can go back and revisit all of this amazing content. And third, I want to flag that we're hosting another virtual networking mixer just next week on March 30th. The discussion topic will be plant-based sales and trends in plant-based proteins. So over 600 introductions were made at our last mixer. So I really hope you all sign up and join. We'll drop a link in the chat right now for anyone who would like to RSVP for that networking. And last but not least, if you could just ask your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat throughout the presentation, this helps us keep track of them more easily. You're of course welcome to ask questions throughout the seminar, but we do have about 30-45 minutes really at the end to really go through and dig into those questions. So please just ask them in the Q&A box. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. First, we have Neeru Ravi, who is a principal at the Boston Consulting Group. She is a core member of BCG's consumer and climate and sustainability practices. Neeru is the topic lead for alt proteins in North America. And since joining the firm in 2015, Neeru has worked with clients across the US and the UK. Her functional focus has been on consumer insights, consumer segmentation, growth strategy development, pricing, consumer-centric sustainability, and alt proteins. Welcome, Neeru. We are also joined by Emma Tanovic, who is a project leader at Boston Consulting Group and a member of their consumer practice. Her work focuses on consumer products and retail across growth strategy, marketing, operations, and due diligence. Emma is an expert in behavioral science and holds a PhD in psychology, and she is particularly passionate about alt proteins. Both Neeru and Emma are co-authors of BCG's thought leadership publication, Taking Alternative Mainstream, which we will be digging into today. So welcome, Neeru, welcome, Emma. I'll now hand the reins over to both of you.
Thanks, Audrey.
Thanks, Audrey. Great. We'll start with a quick introduction to BCG for those who may be unfamiliar with our organization. So we're a leading global management consulting firm, and we help clients tackle their toughest challenges and capture their biggest opportunities. Climate is one of BCG's top strategic priorities, and within that, food systems and security is a key pillar. And we're a trusted partner to organizations across the entire agri-food value chain, from consumer packaged goods companies to investors to ingredient companies, etc. And within alternative proteins, we have deep expertise, and that's the focus of our conversation today. We've published several thought leadership publications on alternative proteins over the last few years. So in 2021, the Food for Thought publication focused on sizing the global alternative protein market and developing analysis on when we might reach cost parity for the different types of protein. And one key insight was that the market for alternative proteins would be $195 billion by 2030, with 8% share of the total protein market. The next paper that was released in 2022 was focused on the climate opportunity, and the analysis showed that alternative proteins were the best investment from a carbon savings perspective, and that by achieving 8% of the total protein market, we could result in carbon savings equivalent to decarbonizing almost the entirety of the aviation industry. That then leads to the paper that we published a few weeks ago, which is about how do we maximize on this market opportunity and this climate opportunity, and that's by winning with mainstream consumers. And we've outlined a 4-step approach to do that, and that's what we'll be diving into in detail today. So to put all of this in context, why does this matter now? Let's take a look at the US alternative protein retail market over 2022. So this data is the grocery retail sales in billions of dollars from 2019 to 2022. As we all know, from 2019 to 2020, there was a big growth spike, and then it was flat from 2020 to 2021. And then over the last year, there has been growth about 9%, and that's been driven by alternative dairy, with alternative meat staying fairly flat and slightly negative. Digging into that in a little bit more detail, if we go look at alternative dairy first, the overall growth, as we saw, was strong, and across the categories, refrigerated milk, spreads, etc., all of those have gained share since 2019, with refrigerated milk being the largest of the categories. The picture is slightly different when we look at alternative meat, and sales are mixed, with a growth in frozen, but a decline in refrigerated. And across the board, from 2019 to 2022, there was a slight increase in meat share, traditional meat share. And there's a few reasons behind this. One of them is a potential decrease in shelf space for plant-based in the refrigerated meat section, and a shift towards frozen. But there are also several other factors which we'll jump into on the next page. So traditional meat saw a decline in volume over the last few years as well, but that was made up for by an increase in price. So that's the red line. On the left-hand side, you see volume. On the right-hand side, you see price. When we look at frozen plant alternative proteins, we see, again, a decline in volume, but an increase in price. However, for refrigerated, that decline in volume is not made up for an increase in price. And so that contributes to that overall stagnation within the alternative meat sector. There's various drivers of this slowdown. A few of them include a channel shift, so from pandemic to post-pandemic, moving from grocery retail to food service. Another is inflation and increased prices. Third, questions around the product, especially with a large increase in the number of brands offering these products. And finally, a piece around the marketing of the products and how they are messaged to consumers. And this is what we really want to dig into in our conversation today. So we all know that alternative proteins are a big driver of carbon savings, and that animal agriculture is a large contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. It's about 26%. Food systems are 26%, and animal agriculture is 15%. So we all know that. And our last report, moving on to the next page, highlighted that plant-based proteins have the highest carbon savings per $1 trillion of investment versus multiple other sectors. So from a business context, investing in this area makes a lot of sense. But from a consumer perspective, sustainability isn't the main driving factor for their choices. And that's what we really mean when we talk about taking a consumer-centric lens to sustainability. So when we do look at the consumer research, and this is based on a survey of over 2,000, almost 3,000 consumers, there's a big gap in what consumers say versus what they do. So 80% of consumers, so both the core and the mainstream consumers, say that they care about sustainability, but only 20% of these consumers, the core consumers, are making their decisions based on sustainability. The majority of the consumers, mainstream, they care about sustainability, but they have other needs that are more important, and they're held back by some barriers, and therefore they're not acting on sustainability in the same way. And then there's also a group of these unconcerned consumers who aren't thinking about sustainability at all. So as you can see from consumers in the fresh food market, the key to driving that growth is winning with these mainstream consumers. And there's different things that appeal to each segment. So for your core consumers, they're already making those decisions based on sustainability, and they're already, buying the products. But for mainstream consumers, there's a couple of actions that we can take. The first is innovating to remove some of those barriers. One in particular is often affordability and price, so breaking some of those trade-offs. And the second is broadening the dialogue. So talking about sustainability alone will not be enough. So connecting the marketing, the messaging, the packaging to some of the needs that matter more for them in terms of making food choices. So let's talk a little bit about what those needs are. So in our survey of consumers buying fresh food, health and taste were the top needs that drive their purchasing decisions. So that's the chart in the middle. On the right-hand side, for purchasing alternative proteins, taste, nutritional value, and health were also the top purchase criteria. So when it comes to marketing those products, it's important to connect it to these needs of health, of taste, to really appeal to the drivers of decisions for these consumers. However, what we see is that over the last year, the association of alternative proteins with health and taste has been declining. So this data is from social sentiment. And on the left-hand side, you see the association or the penetration of taste and health related conversations on alternative proteins. And as you can see, from 2021 to 2022, this has declined. And on the flip side, what we see is there's more conversations connecting alternative meat with some more of these processed, complex, ultra-processed, toxin-type conversations. So that highlights a mismatch between what is driving consumers to buy these products versus what the conversations have been. And this is what we talk about in terms of a potential marketing mismatch. And the other thing to note in terms of the broader context is there's also been lots of advertisements talking about some of these terms of processed toxins, etc., which could be contributing to some of this consumer perception. So we know that to win with the mainstream consumers, we have to appeal to their higher needs of taste and health. We know that talking about sustainability is not enough. So the real question is, how do we do it? And how do we correct some of that mismatch between what's driving the purchasing behavior versus those perceptions? And this is, we have a 4-step approach, which I'll turn it to Emma to talk us through.
Thanks, Nero. So exactly, as Nero was saying, we wanted to understand, tactically, specifically, what should companies be doing to address this? And to get at that, we analyzed over 100 recent behavioral science articles, as well as leveraging some of our own BCG consumer surveys with over 3,000 consumers to arrive at these 4 specific strategies that companies can use in their marketing on front of pack. We focused on front of pack specifically because this is where marketing real estate is the most limited, it's particularly impactful, but these insights are also applicable to other consumer touchpoints too when you're trying to reach the mainstream consumer, but I'll talk about it through the lens of front of pack. So of these 4 different strategies, we think of 2 as quick wins that are relevant across the board and relatively straightforward for brands to implement. And those are limiting vegan labeling and identifying the protein source. Then we also have two that we consider occasion-dependent practices. And what we mean by this is that these are strategies that are also likely to be broadly relevant, but implementing them does require having a bit of an understanding of who the target consumer is and what their needs are in the target occasion that you're going after. And so these two are highlighting the product's sensory appeal and highlighting positive health benefits. So just to give you an example of why these would be occasion dependent, let's say you have a product that's very aligned to an indulgent occasion where consumers want just a delicious treat, they want it to taste great, and they're not really caring about to what extent it's healthy, then health claims probably aren't going to be what's going to resonate most here. And so overall, that's what we mean by occasion dependent. And now we'll dive into each four of these in a bit more detail. So when it comes to limiting vegan labeling, the fundamental rationale behind this is that vegans and vegetarians actually make up a very small portion of the overall market, so about 5% combined. So trying to appeal to these consumers specifically is not going to be what's going to drive mainstream growth. And in fact, appealing to these consumers over others actually does carry some risks. So the first is that using an identity-based label can introduce a psychological barrier. So the consumer thinks, well, I'm not vegan, so this product must not be for me. Or if I consume this product, what does that say about me? It starts to take us into territory that can be psychologically fraught and trigger some of this identity and group-based reasoning that's unlikely to really drive sales. And in fact, from some of GFI's research in collaboration with MindLab, we also see that it's actually associated with lower purchase intent compared to terms like plant-based. And when we ask consumers explicitly, they also tell us that it's not very compelling. So what we recommend instead is using non-identity related terms instead. So doesn't contain animal products, for example, to convey that same information without relying on an identity-based label. Our next quick win is identifying the alternative protein source. So this is something that evidence has supported for a while, but it's becoming increasingly relevant, especially as concerns about how processed products might be have grown, as Neera was showing us. And when you think about it at a fundamental level, it makes sense that consumers would want to know what they're eating. So what the evidence shows us is that specifying the protein source is associated with higher overall ratings. And here you see some differences in this chart across protein types, but these differences are small across the different proteins, and they vary by different types of categories that are used in this study. So I don't want you to over-anchor on those. The real takeaway here is that specifying the source is better than not specifying it at all. And in addition to driving higher overall ratings, we see that specifying the source also drives taste and health scores as well. And I'll note here, of course, we can specify the source with words and labels, but this is also an opportunity to leverage images of what those key ingredients actually are on front of pack. Okay, so next we'll talk about the first occasion-dependent practice, which is highlighting the product's sensory appeal. So when you have a product that truly delivers on some aspect of the sensory experience, like for example, taste or texture, or even just the emotional enjoyment of eating it. For example, it's something you consume on fun occasions, or it brings you back to a happy memory. In those kinds of instances, it makes sense to highlight that on front of pack to drive choice. So the chart that we're showing here shows the results of a seminal study that looked at the effect of changing the labels of plant-based dishes So in one condition, they had a simple descriptive label that just factually stated what the food was. So green beans. And in another, they added an indulgent label that described sensory elements. So sweet, sizzling. And what they saw is that the frequency with which people chose the dish was 25% higher when it carried the indulgent label. And we're talking about an identical dish. Nothing is different about the product. The only thing that changes is using this sensory taste forward language. I highlight this study because it's a particularly well-known one, and I think it powerfully illustrates the point. But there is also evidence that this holds true for plant-based analog products as well, not just vegetable dishes. So important to keep in mind. And then on packaging, in addition to labels, this is another good opportunity to leverage visuals, which when done well can drive taste associations, drive overall appeal, and also purchase intent. And then finally, our last practice is another occasion-dependent one where we recommend highlighting positive health benefits. So why do I say positive? Well, research shows that consumers respond more to health claims that use positive rather than restrictive language, meaning that they're highlighting the presence of a good attribute rather than the lack of a bad one. So for example, if you say high protein rather than low calorie. And what's also important to note here is that we're recommending going beyond simply sharing nutritional information. So instead of saying just 10 grams of protein, to actually go on to say great source of protein. Of course, there is regulation about what the nutritional profile needs to be in order to make those kinds of claims. So this is something that you can only do when your product actually delivers on some element of health, but it can be a pretty powerful driver. So we see that including these kinds of messages on front of pack increases willingness to consume the product and perceived quality. And it also has a kind of halo effect to increase perceived sustainability. From some of our research at BCG, we know that sustainability and health tend to go hand in hand for consumers. They're correlated. But what we see is that health can actually sometimes be correlated negatively with other needs, like taste. So in other words, when you tell consumers that a product is healthy, they actually expect it to taste less good. And so this is why we think of this as an occasion-dependent practice, where you do need to think about developing a detailed understanding of where exactly in the demand landscape you want to play. And then thinking about, do you want to highlight health? Do you want to highlight sensory appeal? Does it actually make sense for this specific occasion to be highlighting both? So bringing in that nuance since it is occasion-dependent. Okay. So these are the 4 best practices. Hopefully this is making sense. I'm happy to dive into any questions afterward. But these are the 4 best practices that we think alternative meat brands should consider. And when we look at alternative dairy, it actually provides a helpful case study in how this can be done to drive mainstream growth. So we know that alternative dairy has actually done a really good job at this. Like Niru was saying, we've seen positive sales growth, and alternative dairy has reached 8% penetration overall of the broader dairy category. So it's doing something well, and we analyzed the front of pack marketing for the top 25 alternative dairy brands. And we found that most, so 88%, are actually implementing 2 or more of these practices. So on this slide, we have some examples of how this is done. So for limiting vegan labeling, we see many brands saying dairy-free, for example. On identifying the protein source, of course, this is very common even in the product name, right? Like almond milk or oat milk. But beyond that, we also see brands kind of lean into it by showing images of the ingredient, like Simply is doing here with oat milk and oats. And then we do also see brands highlight sensory appeal. So this example from Silk highlights a bit of the texture, so rich and creamy. And then many brands also highlight health benefits. So here we have an example with calcium content, many others like vitamin A, D, omega-3, so on. So alternative dairy is doing this well, but when we look at alternative meat, what we see is that only about half of the top 25 brands are implementing 2 or more of these practices. So many do limit vegan labeling, but relatively few are identifying the protein source. Relatively few are highlighting health benefits, and even fewer are emphasizing the sensory appeal. And importantly, we see that this does seem to really matter for performance. So when we look at retail sales performance going back to 2019, alternative meat brands that implement 2 or more of these best practices have outperformed competitors by a wide margin, so 6-1. Now, of course, there could be additional drivers of brands' performance beyond marketing, but what this analysis tells us is that there's likely some real value that can be realized from applying these insights that we've seen from behavioral science to how brands approach what they're doing on front of pack. Okay. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Nero.
Thanks, Emma. So it's clear that we need to win with these mainstream consumers and to drive growth over the next few years. So there's 4 steps to consider in that journey. The first is really understanding the needs of the mainstream consumer, and especially what their needs are in the occasions of use. So who are they with in that moment? Where are they? What are they doing when they're consuming the product? What are their emotional and functional needs at the time of use? So, and that really will differ based on occasion to occasion. So for example, a celebratory family dinner will be different to an on-the-go breakfast. And so having that nuanced understanding of needs is essential as a starting point to be able to really win with the mainstream consumers. And taking a demand-centric growth approach can really be valuable. So segmenting the addressable market based on these demand drivers and identifying pockets of consumers who have common emotional and functional needs. The second is to innovate to improve taste, texture, and price, and break some of these trade-offs that are holding consumers back. So we know that there's been significant improvements along these dimensions over the last few years, but in the minds of consumers, there still seems to be a gap between these products and traditional meat. So there is room to still innovate and test new products to really understand what resonates with mainstream consumers. The third piece is to tailor the messaging to the mainstream and apply those 4 principles that Emma just walked us through, and broadening the dialogue from beyond sustainability to the needs that matter most for consumers. And these need to be connected also to the specific occasions that matter for the particular product. And then finally, it's really important to take a rigorous test and learn approach and that iterative mindset. Consumers are notoriously bad at predicting how they're going to behave when they're asked. And so it's important to be able to perform tests in that real world environment and try out some of these changes. And that approach can also lead to a better understanding of which specific kinds of messages will resonate for the particular occasion that the products are tailored for. So just to summarize, there's a lot of clear evidence that alternative proteins are key for making that transition to reducing emissions. We also know that there's a market out there for them, but consumers really need to hear brands speak to their higher needs that matter to them on taste and health, and taking that consumer-centric approach is critical to winning with that mainstream consumer. We've seen that alternative dairy has done this and it's growing, and so there's potential to extend some of those learnings to alternative meat as well and set up for long-term growth. We'll pause there, and happy to take questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Emma and Nero. That was a fantastic presentation that packed in a ton of content. Just a reminder to everyone, if you could please ask your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat, that helps us keep track of them more easily. And there have been some questions flowing in throughout your presentation. So the first few are more around wanting to understand your data sources a bit more. So a few people asked if the data you shared is for the US market only, and if you have any regional specific research results from maybe Europe, Middle East, Israel, Singapore, etc.
Yeah, our data is leveraging the SPINS and IRI data source, and so it is focused on the US. Within the US, we don't have a regional breakdown available. Stepping back to think about it globally, in terms of like the extent to which our insights apply across different markets, we do know that there are nuances in some of these strategies. Like, for example, in Europe, it's actually pretty common to use vegan labeling, and it's not perceived as niche of a category as it is in the US. So there are regional differences, and I think it would be really exciting to explore those globally. That said, a lot of these psychological processes are still going to carry forward across different markets. So we're talking about some pretty basic cognitive processes that underlie how some of these decisions are made. So for example, when you think about identifying the protein source, those are things that we would expect to be consistent. I hope that gets at the question.
Thank you. And these are a bit more granular and specific around the data. Do you have data around shelf-stable plant-based meats? Was that something that you looked at during your studies?
Yeah, we would have liked to look at it, but it's not broken out in this data source, unfortunately. We only had shelf-stable traditional.
Got it. And do you have data on alternative meat sales via companies like Costco? Were those included in the survey results?
Club is not included in this data source. So it's looking at multi-outlet, so like traditional grocery, convenience, and then we also include the natural channel, which makes up a sizable portion of sales, but unfortunately no Costco.
Great. And this other, I love how this one's phrased. Have alt meats lost their sizzle in food service? Was food service an area that you were looking at when doing this study?
It's a great question. And we focus this report on the retail market, but one interesting data point from our conversation with Rachel, who's the CEO of the Plant-Based Foods Association, she shared that nearly half of the restaurants in the US offer plant-based options today, and 4 times as many plan to add plant-based meat to their menu versus those who plan to drop it from their menu in 2023. So that highlights that to your question, they haven't lost their sizzle, and there is scope there to grow.
Thanks. And just a note for everyone listening in, GFI will be coming out with food service data soon. I believe that we'll be hosting another seminar about that in June. So please stay tuned for some more data there in terms of food service. And moving on to the next question, you mentioned specifically taste, nutrition, and health as those driving decision makers. What about texture? Is texture included in taste? Is it something separate? Do you think that that is more or less important in changing purchasing behavior?
Yeah, I think Nero, feel free to jump in. When we ask consumers about it, we tend to lump texture in with taste. When we think about the specific things that we need to innovate on, I believe it is both. So both innovations for taste and innovations for texture. Nero, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think when we surveyed respondents specifically on the needs that drive behavior, texture wasn't one of the things that popped up at the top. It was taste and health. So but there is, as we know, scope to innovate on texture as well. So we would suggest, in terms of the messaging, to continue to index on taste and health, where dependent on the occasion, but from a innovation perspective, there's still room to focus on texture.
And I will say, like, when we think about what sensory appeal means, like our recommendation about highlighting sensory appeal, that definitely includes texture as well. Really anything about the overall sensory experience can be a powerful driver of behavior, even though it might not be something that consumers tell you top of mind in a survey that might not get as granular.
Got it. Thank you. And have you seen any signs of traditional product categories being replaced with new and unexpected categories, such as only some meat or blended products? I think are an emerging topic of conversation. Maybe some new vegan flavors, something that is an alternative protein, but not necessarily trying to be a meat analog. What are your thoughts on that, or have you been seeing anything in that category?
I think it's a great question, and this report specifically focused on the alternative proteins from the viewpoint of what exists in the market today, so plant-based, fermentation-based. And so I think there's a lot of scope to continue this research in terms of what would appeal to consumers from a hybrid product point of view, or a cultured meat point of view. So I think there's some nuances there, given the products aren't alternative proteins, they're actually meat directly. So I think there's scope to extend this research, but it wasn't the focus of what we covered.
Yeah, and I think, well, jumping off of that, one thing that we've been thinking about is the potential for hybrid products. Of course, that's been a hot topic, thinking about incorporating cultivated meat with plant-based meat. But I think it's kind of interesting to think about how consumers reason about hybrid products. So for a little while, there was potentially a push to have blended plant-based and animal-derived products that didn't exactly gain traction. But when we think about the potential climate impact, it's just dimensional, right? So a product that is 50% plant-based and 50% animal is the same thing as consuming 2 plant-based products, right? And so, well, I said that the reverse, but you know what I mean. And so I think it is really important for us to be creative about the way that we can deliver these decarbonization solutions while bringing consumers along, so that we can get their buy-in the way that traditionally hybrid products haven't seen yet.
I don't know, that's an interesting topic around the hybrid products. I was just at Future Food Tech in San Francisco, and I was hearing so much more about hybrid products from a range of folks than I ever had before. And some of the sentiment seemed to feel that the struggle with hybrid products to date has been more of a marketing failure than a product failure. So I think it's really interesting to see what might happen with those blended hybrid products in the future.
I think, just to jump off on that, some of the principles that we outlined are still highly relevant in that context. For example, identifying the protein source and making it very clear in that context what is included and what isn't included. So some of these, highlighting the sensory appeal, the health benefits, etc., all of those still are very relevant.
It's a great point. And this next question here is, were there any brands that were eligible to highlight health benefits that were not highlighting them? Was that something that you observed in the data?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, there were a couple. One brand actually, so I'll share some examples generally. I won't call out any specific brands. But one brand actually, as we were doing the analysis, changed their packaging. So they went from highlighting the number of grams of protein to actually making a claim about it being a good source of protein. So there were some instances like that. But the way that we went about the analysis was just analyzing what was available front of pack. We didn't do a deep dive into the actual nutritional information. Not sure we would be exactly qualified to analyze all the nutritional information. But I think it's a great question to see how much opportunity is there.
Absolutely. And kind of building off of the health benefit, health claim question, this next person is curious about the challenges for alt proteins with flavor and health, and maybe there's some inherent tension between those two. This person saying consumers seem to be seeking increasingly those clean label products, but to create that taste, texture, flavor dynamic that some of those first generation alt protein products have, they might need to have high sodium, maybe some questionable ingredients. Are there innovations in ingredients and sodium substitutes right now? Or what do you think of that? Is there an inherent tension between those, and how would you think about that?
It's a great question. And I go back to the point around really understanding the occasions that the product is being used. And that's where that tension between taste and health really comes in, because, for example, for as I mentioned, for like a celebratory family dinner, you want something that's like really delicious and really indexes more on that taste component, and maybe you prioritize health a little bit less in that context. Whereas if you're looking for a healthy lunch option, then health might index more there, and you prioritize that. So really thinking about the products that you're developing, which occasion is it for, and therefore what's the relative importance of taste versus health, and then using that to guide the decisions on how much consumers would be willing to accept various amounts of ingredients in the product.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think what we heard from some of the experts that we talked to in putting together our report is that there is innovation underway to cut down on ingredient lists, to improve nutritional profiles while still delivering on taste. I mean, taste is paramount for most companies. That said, I think also there's a bit of a distinction between the clean label trend, processed food, and health. So foods that have a longer ingredient list aren't necessarily not delivering on some of the health benefits that might be important to consumers, like Nira was saying. So again, it does really go back to the point around understanding demand, where for some consumers, okay, it might be that a shorter ingredient list is really what they're looking for. But for others, it might really be about delivering on specific health needs that you can do even when you're delivering on taste by including these additional ingredients.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think those are really important things to highlight. And I'm just going to drop in the chat right here a seminar that GFI held last year on consumer perceptions of alt proteins that looked to see what consumers thought of various ingredients that were commonly found in alt protein products. I think some of the findings there may surprise you, so encourage folks listening to take a peek at that seminar. And building off of what you were mentioning earlier around occasions and really understanding the occasions that consumers are consuming your product at, how do you go about predicting the occasions that your product is most relevant for? What would you say are some top occasion examples?
Nira, do you
wanna
want
take this one?
to? Okay.
I can speak to it. So I think, so one, our typical approach to go about this is to take a demand-centric approach, which is to say, to walk a customer through their journey of choosing breakfast, lunch, snacks, etc., and what's driving those decisions, and also what context is influencing them in making those decisions. And so I think rather than trying to fit something to an occasion, I think it's important to just hear from the consumers on what they're looking for at various occasions in the day, and then based on that, try to understand where the products would then fit. So I think there's many kind of combinations of them. It's not just breakfast, lunch, or dinner. There's also celebrations or snacks, etc. So I think taking that consumer first approach is what will then ultimately lead to being able to connect the products better to the consumer. So I'd say start with the consumer versus trying to start with the product and seeing where it would fit to the consumer without understanding the needs of the consumers.
Great. And then we have the next few questions are around demographics. So I'll kind of loop all of these in together. Folks are asking if there are different demographic trends that you're seeing with alt protein products, any generational market trends to comment on around purchase intent. And then this other comment is around most of the surveys that state that plant-based products are aimed for Gen Z and flexitarian. Do you think this is true? Is it also for millennials and others? What are you seeing or finding in terms of demographics and alt proteins?
I'm happy to start on that. I think one of the trends that we see from a demographic perspective is that younger folks, so Gen Z and millennials, we're still young, that they do tend to have higher adoption rates, higher repeat purchase rates than older generations. So I think that's one overall trend. When we think about mainstream growth, though, I think there is still opportunity to appeal to all different segments. So definitely not just flexitarians, definitely not just people who are trying to reduce their meat intake, definitely not just Gen Z. We see that mainstream segment as considerably broader. And so, yeah, wouldn't relegate alternative protein just to those demographics. Nira, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think one data point we saw was, building on what you said about younger consumers, around 36% of Gen Z consumers wanting to limit their meat consumption, but those consumers who are already on that path fit into that core consumer in our concentric circles, the consumers who are already making decisions. So actually appealing to those consumers is relatively easier because they are already doing their research and they're already making the effort themselves. The harder challenge and what is required to get to growth is with these mainstream consumers who care, but they're not taking action yet. So that's where some of these other groups that we don't normally think of, so outside of the vegans, outside of the flexitarians, outside of the people who are already making those strides, like that's where it's important to win. And for those consumers, it's critical to focus away from sustainability and actually talk about taste and health, which we've mentioned several times. So the mainstream consumers are not the ones who are already making these choices.
Got it. Yeah, that's a really great point. And we had at least two questions come in around that topic. I think there's some concerns that vegans and vegetarians are making up the majority of alt meat consumers, and maybe a concern that dropping that vegan labeling will turn off those core consumers in a disproportionate way. Like, is there a trade-off between trying to reach mainstream consumers and potentially abandoning your existing consumer base. And I think there's just some questions around customer strategy in terms of, should you gain traction first with vegan, vegetarian consumers and then going to the mainstream, or should you just target the mainstream consumer straight away? I don't know if you have any thoughts or advice on some of those questions.
Yeah, I think those are all really good questions. I think first, when we actually, so I'll preface what I'm about to say with, it depends. Of course, it's going to be nuanced based on the specific brand and the specific strategy that you want to take. And there are going to be multiple paths to achieving success. That said, for a lot of brands that have shared data, we actually see that the majority of consumers are not vegans and vegetarians. Like, for example, there was a stat recently that 90% of a leading brand's consumers were not vegan or vegetarian. So there is some opportunity. Now, what's critical is to drive repeat purchase rates among those consumers. So not just having them try it once, but having them come back. And those do tend to be lower for non-vegan, non-vegetarian consumers. That was the main point I was going to make. I was going to make another one, but it's not in my mind anymore. Neera, did you want to add?
Yeah, no, I'll actually build on what you said, which is that it's important to also think about the market sizes of some of these groups. So if we think about the vegan and vegetarian group, they fit squarely within that core consumers that we talked about, and that's just 20% of consumers. So if we want to focus there, that's limiting that market potential to just a small group of consumers. And so to get that growth, that mainstream consumer is critical. And so it's really important to broaden beyond just that core group. That said, we're not saying, don't talk about the products being vegan at all. So there's opportunity, for example, in the back of the pack to say something like suitable for a vegan diet, so that anyone who is vegan can still know that it's suitable for them and we're not alienating them. It's just making sure that as we're thinking about the mainstream consumer, we're focusing on what really matters to them, because they're not going to be doing the same amount of research to figure out the products that a vegan consumer might be willing to put in.
Those are all really, really fantastic points, and something that everyone should be considering. I love that data point that 90% of at least one brand's consumers are flexitarians and meat eaters. That's really awesome to hear. This is switching gears entirely. So the next question is around government regulation, and if you see government regulations impacting options for consumers. Did government regulation play any factor in what you were looking at, or was that not really the focus of your study?
That wasn't the focus of our study. The only connection point that is that if any government regulation were to impact what companies can put on their packaging or what labeling they can use, that obviously would impact their ability to use some of these principles. But these recommendations sort of agnostic of any government restrictions.
And funnily enough, our report came out, I think maybe the day before the FDA guidance on the new milk labeling requirements and suggestions. But I think in general, our points still stand. I think, if you were in a situation where you had to include labeling on front of pack that emphasized deficits relative to animal milk, that likely would be suboptimal. But I think still using the opportunity to highlight areas in comparison to animal milk where your product does better is consistent. And I think this is not exactly what the question was, since it's not about regulation, but I do think thinking about overall government involvement, there is an opportunity to leverage, to drive like a bit more education overall for consumers. So some of the barriers that consumers perceive about the category come from a place of not having all of the information about exactly what these products are, like exactly how to use them, exactly in what ways they might be beneficial. So thinking broadly as an industry, there's likely potential for constructing a narrative to educate consumers about the category broadly beyond the actions of individual brands. And that's an area where government could lean in, given some of the potential upside of these products, or where industry efforts could also lean in.
That is such a great point, and I really appreciate hearing ways in which the industry can work together to build up an entirely new area of business and new categories versus maybe cannibalizing one another. So the next series of questions is looking a bit at the kind of production pillars of alt proteins. Of course, plant-based is the farthest along. Most products on the shelves right now are plant-based products. Do you have any thoughts on new proteins created via fermentation? Are there any findings on the outlook for plant-based meat versus cultivated meat versus fermentation-derived products? Do you see these all as being complementary to one another? Or will there be cannibalization between these categories? How are you thinking about that looking to the future when we will have more production technologies available for people to choose from?
I'll touch a little bit on the outlook perspective from a market sizing that we've done, and then Emma, feel free to chime in with anything else. So in our first Food for Thought publication that was in 2021, our assessment was on the market size was that we'd be $195 billion of the global alternative protein market by 2030, and then 290 billion by 2035. And of that 290 billion in 2035, the majority would be plant-based, with an increasing portion from fermentation, and then a small component from animal cell-based, with both of those obviously increasing over time, especially for the critical pieces for those being reaching that parity on cost, given that they're still in the scaling up phases. So I think we see overall growth, and we're still confident in that growth trajectory, with the critical pieces for scaling of the others outside of plant-based being achieving parity on cost, as well as because for cell-based, the taste and textures is already there, so the actual big question is on cost. And then on fermentation based, there's still taste, texture, and cost. And then plant-based, we've rapidly increased along that journey to get to cost parity. So that's why that's the bulk today.
And just adding on to that from sort of like the consumer insights or behavioral science perspective across different technologies, I think there's a lot of opportunity there to understand beyond plant-based, how do consumers reason about these categories? I know GFI has recently done some really interesting work, shared in a webinar a few months ago, I think, looking at cultivated meat, naming of cultivated meat, consumers' expectations. And I think right now we're in a bit of a tricky spot. I mean, a really exciting spot, but where consumers aren't yet familiar enough with a lot of these products to really tell us how they feel about them. So it'll be really important to try to develop that understanding of how consumers reason about the categories, kind of in tandem to them actually being more accessible.
That is such a good point. There is so much more that we need to learn about when it comes to consumers' perceptions of these. And I will say that a talking point that GFI often has, we've included this in our upcoming State of the Industry reports, is around hybrid products. And looking to the future, we will see many more hybrid product options. These products created across the continuum of production technologies, and those distinct production pillars will become less relevant when you're looking at end products. And so just to note to everyone, we are at the hour mark. We've extended these seminars, so we have 30 more minutes with Emma and Nero. So we will continue to dive through these questions. There's so many amazing ones flowing in. And just a quick reminder that we are recording this right now, and we will be sharing this with all of you via email, and also posting it to GFI's YouTube channel, where all of our Business About Protein seminars are. So if you have to drop off now, no worries. You can tune into all of the great questions later on, but would love to have you stay on so we can dig into some more questions here. And thank you so much, Nero and Emma, for staying and sharing your expertise with everyone today. So digging back into the questions, are BCG's bold mid and long-term market size forecasts still valid in the light of recent developments in terms of, I'm assuming those recent developments are probably plant-based sales trends or data that's been coming out?
It's a great question, and we stand by those market sizes. I think the context to add there is that those are based on to get to those, there's still room for companies to adapt to some of the recent changes. And I think when it comes to things like the recent alternative meat decline that we just talked about in terms of retail sales, there's some near-term things that can be done and some more longer-term things that can be done. I think from a product innovation perspective, that still needs to, as we mentioned, that still needs to happen, and that's a little bit more of a longer-term action. But there are many near-term wins, and that's what we've been talking about today to help correct some of those challenges and get back onto the path for mainstream adoption. So I think we stand by those, and we think that to actually get to those projections, the mainstream consumer is really important, which is why we've spent so much time talking about it. We think that it's important we think that given many of the products today have many of the qualities that mainstream consumers are looking for from a taste and health perspective, there's opportunities to, even with the existing products, to message them in the way that appeals to mainstream consumers whilst that innovation is taking place.
And just to add on to that, I think, behind our forecasts isn't necessarily the assumption that everything's going to happen in a totally linear fashion. Of course, there can be ups and downs, especially when you're talking about such a relatively small market and growing pains associated with that. That said, even the overall numbers for 2022 still keep us on track for those longer term forecasts.
So wonderful to hear. We have another series of questions around dairy and some of those comparisons to what's going right in plant-based dairy. So I'll just kind of loop these all in together so we can discuss this. The first one is really around alt dairy versus alt meat, and how much of the growth do you think is driven by better product quality of alt dairies versus animal milk? So like what is it? Is it something different about the product, or is it really driven by the key marketing messages? And maybe kind of in that question, there's a separate question here around, is alternative dairy addressing a more mainstream consumer problem like lactose intolerance that might fuel its growth in that area as well?
The answer is it's probably a mix of all of those things. I don't think we're saying it's any one of those. It's a mixture, I think, and that's unfortunately the reality of not being able to piece apart. I think what we see is that those products today are doing a better job of communicating what they offer to consumers. So there could be a component of quality, but there's also a component of just being able to better communicate what the product offers. And I think that's the piece where we feel there's a lot of learnings to take to alternative meat, in how can we take what the products already offer and communicate them in a better way.
Great points. And do you have a point of view in regards to standard of identity? Is there anything to learn from dairy in that regard? There's a comment here that plant-based chicken, like chick apostrophe N, could be confusing to consumers. Do you agree with that?
I would connect it to the point we mentioned on identifying the alternative protein source again. Like, if it's clear to, it might not be fully obvious to consumer when you say chick apostrophe and what the protein source is. And our research on the consumer insights suggests that that's what really matters to consumers, is to know what they're consuming and what the protein source is. So there could be an opportunity with something like that to be able to make it clearer to consumers what they're eating.
Great points. On the kind of labeling, explaining to consumers what they're eating question, do you think that the term meat-free is as effective as plant-based when it comes to labeling? Was there anything in the data exploring those different options?
Yeah, I would say that meat-free tends to score a bit lower than plant-based. But I think using a term that's a little bit more descriptive, like does not contain animal products, gets at the same point, but is just a little bit more palatable to consumers. That said, the data that I've seen on that is a few years old, so it's possible that consumer attitudes have evolved, but yeah, I would suggest something more like does not contain animal products.
Thank you. And I know you talked a bit about this in your presentation, but this question's asking if there are preferred ingredients amongst consumers within the alternative protein category. And then separately, did you look at fat at all and preferred sources of fat when it comes to these products? Fat's obviously a critical part of that sensory experience of eating these products.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We haven't looked at sources of fat and consumers' reasoning around that. I think that would be an interesting direction to go in. When it comes to differences across the different protein types, I think it sounds like, Audrey, you were saying GFI has some good resources on this. From what we've seen is it's just pretty nuanced across different categories and different products. So I wouldn't say, for example, I wouldn't say soy is bad. I think it's important to understand, again, for the occasion that you're targeting with the specific product that you have, how do these different protein types test with consumers?
Got it. And switching gears slightly, do you have any data around plant-based seafood? Was that included in the data that you evaluated, or is that something that you consider to be separate?
We would have loved to include it, but unfortunately it wasn't available within the data set, partially because it continues to be small. So we didn't have it broken out.
But we would say that the principles would still apply. So the 4 ways to reach the mainstream consumer would still be relevant.
Got it. And would those recommendations to reach mainstream consumers change at all if you were to target food service, or do you still feel like those are aligned between retail and food service consumers?
That's a great question. So we focus this on the front of pack messaging. That said, I think this is all at the point of decision making for the consumer. What are they, what information do they have to make that choice? And that's what the front of pack has. So in a food service context, what are they seeing in terms of like the description of the item, etc., is going to be really helpful to influence their decision making. It's a little bit harder in that context to highlight the health benefits, etc., when you're just able to, you know, name what the item is. So if there's any ways in what the product is called to be able to highlight some of those sensory appeals and also the protein source, and limit that vegan and vegetarian labeling, that's what we would recommend. It's sort of how can you bring in some of those elements in how you're describing the product on a menu or in a restaurant without necessarily having too much real estate to be able to explain all of the different components of the product.
Absolutely.
And
Great
we
point,
found
unlimited
that,
real estate.
yeah, and one thing that we saw, which was interesting, is there was a company that had an alternative protein product on their menu that they marketed on the base of taste, and they like crafted it to have a very attractive nutritional profile, and that exceeded the expectations when it was launched. So it's a case in point of being you know, very focused on leveraging that marketing from a taste perspective.
Great points. And building off of that, the next question we have here is curious about your view on if people are seeking more reassurance on the pack and at fixture than earlier on in their shopper journey. This person's making the comment that social listening was very interesting, and that it seems like negative perceptions might be influencing consumers earlier in their journey.
Yeah, I think the social sentiment was also really interesting for us because it shows that you need to be a lot more intentional and you need to work that much more to be able to appeal to that mainstream consumer with your taste and health messages than maybe before. So given that decline, there's more that you need to do. So I would say from a reassurance perspective, I would maybe just rephrase that as making it just that much easier for consumers to make that choice by giving them exactly what they need to see, rather than them having to dig through the packaging and find it, or dig through the message, like the messaging in store to have to find that. And so the reassurance might just come in the form of being able to be really clear on what they're eating, the health benefits of it, and knowing that it's going to you know, taste good or deliver on the needs of their occasion that they're buying it for.
Absolutely. And did you look at all into repeat purchasing behavior? What percentage of current industry revenue is still based on first-time purchases, experimenting with the different brands within plant-based meat, and how much is driven by those repeat purchases, which of course every brand and every company wants to be seeing with their product?
Yeah, I think for us, with the data set that we've included here, we weren't able to disentangle repeat purchases. Of course, what we've seen is that maintaining repeat purchases or increasing them is, of course, a top priority, given that you can only bring in so many new people into the category at a time. So it's definitely something that's top of mind for our clients, and that we've seen, you know, come across in other surveys, but it's not reflected in this data set.
What we would say is on that piece is, whilst we don't have the data, it's important to make sure that the messages that we're suggesting, these like 4 principles to reach mainstream consumers, that they're connected to actually what's true about the product, so that we're able, what consumers actually get what they see they're getting, and that's going to be a key factor in driving some of that repeat purchases. So making sure that we're saying something is healthy, that it's backed up by actual data about the product being healthy, etc., so that we you know, can win on that second purchase.
And I think they're, leveraging innovation and continuing to prioritize it to improve the extent to which products do deliver on that value proposition is going to be critical.
Absolutely. And this maybe leads into the second question is, how do you combat the ultra processed narrative that so many alt protein products have been painted with a broad brush? Do you have any thoughts on that? I know earlier you mentioned potentially there's room for industry to unite and step together to articulate a new narrative around alternative proteins. Do you have any other ideas around that?
One thing that comes to mind for me is actually understanding a little bit more about what the consumer concerns are from an ultra processed point of view, because whilst that is gaining a lot of attention from a conversation perspective, which we saw, and the conversations are increasing, there's a lot of we saw some ads out there that talk about the narrative. What does that mean to consumers, and what is worrying for them about that? Is it specific ingredients? Is it they're put off by a long list? What is it about it? Because I think without really knowing that, it's hard to be able to combat that or innovate. For example, a combination of solutions could be like, you need to innovate to reduce the number of ingredients, or you need to take out this particular ingredient. But I think it's important to understand, and also how much does the ultra processed matter for different occasions. So there might be an occasion where you just want to have something really indulgent and that tastes delicious, and you don't even care that it's ultra processed or whatever that means to you. Whereas for different occasions, you really care about the list of ingredients. So I'd say that we need to start with that consumer understanding.
And I think sometimes we can have the impulse to say, okay, well, traditional meat is actually also highly processed, and kind of drawing that comparison. But I think to really get at the heart of the issue and really drive consumer choice takes that kind of understanding that Nira was describing.
Yeah, and I would encourage everyone to check out that consumer insights seminar from last year that I dropped into the chat. I think there could be I was at least surprised by some of the findings, particularly around how little awareness consumers had of many different ingredients, and not really seeming to care that much about their presence in products, which may surprise some folks on the call. How much of a price premium are consumers currently willing to pay for healthier alt protein products, if any? Did that emerge anywhere in the data that you looked at? Obviously, bringing prices down is such a key area of focus for many of these products. Did you see anything there in that?
So we didn't go into the details on like what the specific price premium would be, but going back to our concentric circles of consumers, if you take that pie, there's that 20% of consumers who completely don't care. So they're about sustainability, they're not going to pay they're not going to even buy the products, let alone consider a premium. The core consumers, that 20%, they're making that decision, making their purchasing decisions based on sustainability. Those are the only consumers who would be willing to consider a premium, paying a premium for sustainable products or alternative protein products. And that mainstream consumer isn't making any decisions based on sustainability today, so that consumer isn't going to be one that would be willing to pay that premium. So if we look at the market that way, the importance of getting to that cost parity becomes really paramount, because the majority of those consumers aren't making any decisions based on sustainability today, and therefore will not be considering paying that premium.
And I think when you ask mainstream consumers about their willingness to pay, like Nira said, because sustainability isn't driving their choices, the answer is 0% more is what they're willing to pay. But I think it's also important to think about exactly what kind of comparison we're making and to compare like for like products. So alternative meat products could be playing in a premium segment, where you want to charge a premium price because that's consistent with your brand and your strategy. And there you might be competing with a more expensive cut of meat or a more expensive type of product. So when we look at averages and see that plant-based products are definitely still at a high premium relative to traditional meat products, it is important to disaggregate that across price segments.
And also, I think it goes back to how well these products are meeting the needs of the consumers. So if we put ourselves in the consumer's shoes, they're looking to optimize for the product, whether that be an alternative protein or a traditional protein that best meets their needs. And so in that context, the more we can do to not just get to parity, but exceed some of those characteristics of traditional meat, the more likely it is that the consumer will be willing to pay extra for something that better meets their needs.
Thank you. And the next two questions here go back a little bit to the demographic conversation that we were having earlier. Someone's asking, does BCG data have a distinction between higher likelihood for consumption of alt proteins based on gender? Did you look at gender at all when evaluating the data?
Yeah, so gender wasn't a focus of the cuts that we did in this specific case, but what we've seen from our data and other data on some of this behavioral science literature is that women do tend to purchase more alternative meat products.
And then an additional question along with this one is around reaching older generations. They can often be challenging to reach them. Do you have any successful strategies that all protein companies can use to reach older demographics?
I think that, so our research didn't split out strategies by different consumer segment, but just given what, some of that lack of familiarity probably with these products in the older generations, it's even more important to take that simpler approach of making it very clear what they're eating, and also from the protein source perspective, the health benefit perspective, but also being very targeted on the needs that they're looking for. And those needs might be different for those consumers in those occasions. So there might be more of a convenience angle, or a price might be more important, etc. So being able to be even more targeted for the needs that matter to those consumers in those occasions will be, I think, the unlock.
And just jumping off of that, I mean, I think older consumers are a segment like any other where we should take that kind of consumer-centric lens like Neera was talking about. I think one opportunity is around health. So older consumers tend to, the extent to which you care about health in your food purchases does tend to increase with age, and particularly around like functional benefits. So to the extent that there's opportunities to lean into health messaging or specific health attributes, that could potentially resonate. But again, it's another segment that requires a detailed understanding of what those needs are.
That's a really interesting observation about how some factors can change, or consumers can weight different elements by stage of life, and also the occasion at which they're eating it, which you keep mentioning. So apart from improving the product and optimizing marketing efforts, to what extent do you think there are educational levers worth pursuing to drive alt protein adoption? Do you feel like consumer education is a barrier or is lacking?
I'll jump in here, and Emma, feel free to also chime in. But I think going back to some of our narrative around the ingredients in the products and the processed nature of them, etc., given that there's been some content in the media about the processed nature of them, is that there could be an opportunity to talk a little bit more about actually what's in them, how they're made, etc., to bring a different perspective. So there's an opportunity from that perspective. I think from a sustainability perspective, talking more about how products are more sustainable, etc., isn't necessarily going to be what tips the scales for the mainstream consumer, given what we know about what influences their decisions. So we know that taste and health matter. How can we educate them more to know that these alternative protein products can be healthy and they can be tasty? And the more we can build those associations, the easier it will be for them to make that switch and start eating these products.
And just one other thing I would add is convenience as well. Sometimes that comes up as a potential barrier, sort of believing that these products might not be as convenient to cook with. And in a lot of instances, that's not the case. And so there's opportunity for education sort of at the overall brand level, to, offer recipes, explain cooking techniques, have chef tutorials on Instagram, things like that, to drive education in that kind of brand context that could be helpful across the category.
That's a great point, Emma. And I think that to kind of put a little bit of a framework on it, the way we think about it is you want to innovate to break some of these real barriers, like the trade-offs around affordability. You want to educate to overcome some of these perceived barriers, like the fact that these products might be difficult to cook with. And then the third piece is you want to be able to communicate and market what already exists today in a better way to meet the needs of the consumer. So I kind of bucket it into those three, and the education piece really sits around how we can overcome some of these perceived barriers that don't actually exist, but are in the minds of the consumers.
Those are all fantastic points. We have time for probably one more question today. We've had a lot of questions, so apologies. We haven't been able to get to all of them, but for the last one here, it's asking, is the 20% core consumer, 60% mainstream consumer a standard way of looking at consumers, or is that a split specific to alternative proteins?
Great question. It's actually a split for the fresh food segment. So we really like to think of alternative proteins in the context of the broader set of products that consumers are choosing from, and so that's why we put it into the fresh food context. And so that 20-60 split applies there. Is roughly the same in other sectors, but there's obviously some different nuances, but this is specific to fresh food.
Thank you. So that's all that we have time for today. Neero, Emma, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise, sharing all this great information about the report. Just a reminder to everyone, we will be emailing you a copy of this presentation and a link for you to go and download the report and read it all yourselves. There's obviously so much fantastic information and takeaways for all of us in the alt protein world to use from this information. I loved all of the connections that were being made in the chat. That was so fun to see. And if you would like to connect with more folks in the alt protein industry, we are hosting that virtual networking mixer on March 30th. You can sign up for that on GFI's website. Just go to our events page and look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.